Alright, so I'm Abhishek. You can call me Abby, it's easier. I am an AI ethics researcher. I don't think there's a lot of people doing that in the world, so it's a fairly new thing. I have a background in computer science. I had 2 startups before. I had an energy efficiency startup where we sought to optimize energy consumption use, incentivizing people to save money. And the second startup was around how we can apply deep learning to mental health outcomes. And yeah, right now I'm focused on the ethical development of AI because I believe that as AI becomes more and more widespread, I mean, you guys are here, so obviously you get it. I don't need to explain that to you, but the entire ecosystem is activated around that, and I think we need to start thinking about, well, what are the ethical considerations as this becomes more widespread. So I guess just to preface the talk a little bit, my research and what I'm going to talk about today is more focused on the current issues in AI development. So I'm not so much concerned with dystopian, futuristic scenarios where you have Terminators taking over the world or whatever else you read in things like I guess not to call out any names, but things like superintelligence and other things where they talk about fairly futuristic and dystopic scenarios. My concern is more around present day situations. So thinking more about things that are happening with police departments in the United States when they take decisions on recidivism rates. So they have racial bias there. So how do we start to address those things which are more concrete, which are happening today? And so that's really my my area of focus. So who's familiar with the trolley problem? There's like very few people. All right. Okay. So the trolley problem is this. It's this canonical problem in ethical and moral reasoning, where you think about you have this sort of trolley or train car that's going on tracks, and you can choose whether to kill 5 people on one track or 1 person on the other track, and there are many classical variations around what you can do. So it sort of centers around relegating control, as in not taking any action, so inaction leading to some harm, or taking a particular action and then leading to some harm, right? So it's great as a model of thinking, as a way to reason through some of these conundrums, and turns out in self-driving this turns out to be a very handy tool. The problem with this is that it looks at a lot of scenarios again that are possibly very unlikely and that are very hypothetical. So when you talk about common discourse in media is, okay, well there's someone on the sidewalk who's a pregnant mother versus there's a kid who's running, which way do you go, right? So a lot of the times real life decisions are not that binary, right? So even though this trolley problem is a great handy tool to think about this, I think there are other more concrete concerns that we can start thinking about today as self-driving cars will start to roll out soon. As an example, what is the responsibility of the manufacturers, the developers towards the buyer of that vehicle? So let's say you were to walk into a dealership, right? And the sales representative is walking around showing you all the great features of the new version of the car. Do you think it's their responsibility to mention that one of these vehicles prioritizes driver safety much more than the other? Would you be willing to buy a vehicle that doesn't prioritize driver safety as much? Show of hands, if a vehicle did not prioritize your driver safety, would you want to buy it? Not that many people. Is that, say it again? No? Yes? No. Okay. So that's very clear, right? And then what happens if everybody, you were, let's say, a fairly representative group, as an example. What happens when everybody thinks like that, right? So what happens to pedestrian safety? What happens to the insurance industry in that case? When you're always prioritized and it just mows over 5 people because it wants to keep you alive, right? So, how do you reason about that? So it quickly becomes clear that, there are challenges that are, concrete and that are today, much more than, something that's, Terminator or killer robot in the future. Autonomous weapons systems. So this is a big concern. right? And again, this is very much susceptible to that term killer robots, and aptly so, because if these autonomous systems are making decisions about creating a fatality, then somewhere responsibility lies towards taking a life. So here again, the interesting thing is, well, what is the degree of autonomy beyond which we consider it to be an autonomous weapon system versus not, right? Another possible scenario is, what if this system takes in intelligence and the final metaphorical trigger pulling is done by a trained military personnel? But what if that info is wrong, right? What if that info is flawed? Do we blame the military personnel who pull the metaphorical trigger, or do you blame the developers, or do you blame some other system deployment company that put it into practice? So how do you start to think about those issues, right? And I think there again, when we start to think about it, we want to reason whether you want to embed your own moral perceptiveness into the system, but then does that come with a few biases? Do we expect these systems again to be better than humans, or to perform at par with humans, right? So again, a lot of questions that you need to think about as you start to reason through some of these use cases. So this is I guess a personal favorite of mine, or an area that I'm deeply concerned with is unregulated feedback loops. So the specific use cases that I'm thinking about are in social media. So when you're walking through your Facebook feed, and I'm sure you've heard it in some form or the other, it sort of creates an echo chamber of the views and the opinions that you see. So there was an experiment, I think it was about 4.5 or 5 years ago on Facebook, where what they were able to do was to predict depressive behavior of, they were able to predict individuals who exhibited depressive tendencies. And then what they did was they started to market alcoholic products, right? Now, if you think about it, okay, that from their perspective makes sense, because they're looking to monetize this. They're looking for higher click-through rates. So for them, it makes perfect sense that if they've identified an individual who's more likely to click on alcohol ads, why not? They're monetizing it. But from an ethical perspective, it seems to present a very clear problem where you might be pushing some individuals towards, I don't know, self-harm or suicide. So how do you control that? Should there be some sort of a regulatory authority that sets some standards for people to think about when you have these sort of consequences, right? And I think this is more and more important, because a lot of our lives are lived online, they're lived digitally. And if you have all of these systems, what do you do to sort of accommodate for that? Another example is, how many of you use Gmail? Right? Okay, so pretty much like everybody. Have you noticed that recently, I think it's been maybe 6 months, where they have these sort of pop-up options to auto-reply? Yeah, okay. So if you think about it, they are sort of priming you to respond in a certain way. Now we might say, okay, well, I'm not dumb. If I look at 3 options, I still have freedom of thought, right? But when you look deeper into research in psychology, all of these things like contribute towards tilting your behavior a certain way, right? And when you're presented with these 3 choices, it sort of limits you towards answering in a particular way. Now, what is the consequence of that, right? And of course, the obvious consequence is that they're reading through your email to generate some sort of understanding, and then present you with options. Okay, that's like obvious, but then what is it doing from a behavioral perspective, right? So that's a problem. So we need some sort of a framework or a way to put all of these conflicting thoughts together and to think about this. So I kind of touched upon this before, where these sort of unwarranted doomsday scenarios really drive away from meaningful, productive conversations that we can have today. So I don't know if many of you are familiar that the government of Canada is working towards writing an AI policy paper, right? So these are guys who are, in my knowledge, amongst the first governments to actually come up with such sort of policy and to really like put a lot of thought into it, right? again, I feel that it's sort of our responsibility as researchers, as applied engineers, as even concerned citizens to voice the right type of concerns, to voice the right type of questions, so that these policymakers, the people who are thinking about all of these issues and thinking about creating regulations around them, really take the right decision and not be dragged away in scenarios that are, well, very hypothetical and that may not happen at all, right? Because there are concrete concerns, like we saw through some examples, the concrete concerns that are happening today that we need to think about. So the way I sort of think about it is it's like legislating horses, in the sense that we're trying to come up with these regulations and these things for things like we're trying to regulate horses while Teslas are coming onto the roads, if that makes sense. So what I mean to say by that is that the progress in the AI community is so rapid and it's being deployed at such an unprecedented pace that I think we need to figure out a new paradigm of creating these regulations, creating these sort of frameworks which are fast, nimble, and that are able to digest and adapt themselves to new changes, and produce relevant regulations that apply to the current situation. So just wanted to walk through some of the topics really quickly. So privacy breach through de-anonymization, forced privacy agreements, assignment of liability, and reproducibility. So just to give you a bit of context, and I'll put up the link at the end, I run a Meetup group around AI ethics. It's been active for around, I think, 3 months now. And what we really do there is do a deep dive into specific aspects of AI ethics and really try to reason through some of these hard to think about problems, try to break them down into chunks and come up with concrete proposals. So this is just like a small sampling from the work that we've done through the sessions. So when you think about privacy breach through de-anonymization, I don't know if many of you are familiar, but I think it was 2005, 2006 when Netflix ran a public competition in partnership with Kaggle, and what they did was they released anonymized movie ratings, and what they wanted to do was to leverage the larger AI data science community to come up with a better recommendation system. Sounds great, right? But here's the interesting part. What happened was that there were two researchers, I believe out of Cornell, that what they did was they linked the anonymized data set to the IMDb ratings, which are public. And what they were able to do was to look at the sort of the rare and unique movies, and through that they were able to de-anonymize the data set to a fair extent, right? So again, this makes you think about, well, what happens when such pattern recognition can be applied on a sort of scaled and automated manner, right? And what implications does it have for privacy? The AOL example is a little older, but had similar ramifications where what they were able to do was, again, using AOL search data, they were able to exactly pinpoint the one woman who lived somewhere in, I think it was Midwestern United States, and they were exactly able to find out like where she lived, what her phone number was, like everything that you would deem to be private information that you wouldn't want everybody in the world to know. They pretty much figured that out through her search patterns. They were able to isolate that. So that's sort of a risk that we run when we have these, when we can deploy this at an automated scale. So the forced privacy agreements is something along, when you think about the terms and conditions documents that you read, like how many of you actually go through the entire document? Like when they present it to you. Like if you do it, like we need to talk after, because I work in cybersecurity and I need to see like how you think so that I can start to do that. But the interesting thing there is like what they do is they sort of box you into a solution, and the only way to use that solution is if you sort of have a carte blanche of all of your personal data pieces, right? So what are the implications of this one if you can start to generate sort of the inferences from these personal pieces of personal data, right? And I guess the more interesting question is when these inferences are generated from your personal data and merged with let's say a larger pool, right? does it still constitute your personal data? What degree of control should you have over it? And if I don't know if you know about the GDPR. Quick show of hands if people have heard of or know about GDPR. Okay, some hands around the room. So for those who don't know, the GDPR is a great shining example of what regulation should look like. What it's doing is aiming to enhance user privacy rights, specifically around their personal information in the European Union. So anyone, past May 25th, 2018, who's going to deal with their, EU citizen data will need to comply with with this GDPR regulation. So again, like we need to think about what the boundaries of personal data are in that situation and how we can start to regulate that in an automated setting where inferences can be generated much faster and outside of the control of the developers. Because if you look at just purely big data approaches, like you start with some sort of a hypothesis saying that, okay, well, these are the inferences I want to generate. But when you're looking at automating that entire process of inference generation, how do you control that? And does it even constitute personal information at that point? So that's something to think about. And then this is like fairly obvious that when you're thinking about liability in case there is an adverse or a negative outcome, how do you assign it? Who do you assign it to, right? So the way I like to think about it is looking at the entire spectrum, right? So we're starting at the conception and design phase of a project all the way to the end of life where you have to destroy and delete a project, right? So walking through data collection, deployment, maintenance, and all of these people who are involved with that, like what degree of liability do they have, each of them, as something goes wrong, right? So that's again something to think about, and there's this there's sort of a search for, are there existing models that help us to articulate those concerns and really think about it, and on the other hand really be able to put together a framework that people in the automobile industry, as an example, let's say, can leverage. Going from people who are manufacturing the physical pieces to the people who are developing the software to run the self-driving vehicles. I think another interesting thing that's come about because of the nature of AI is that these are algorithms that will constantly learn and adapt as they move forward, right? So if you look at some of the cutting edge research, some of them can even reconfigure the networks on the fly as they gain more information, right? So at that point, if you haven't really set specific goals around making particular inferences or making sure that there aren't biases or all of that, all of those things, then how do you attribute liability in that case, right? So again, those are concerns to think about. Another thing that's very interesting, and I actually just saw today that Professor Joelle Pinot out of McGill, I don't know if many people know about her. I guess you would. She's heading up the Facebook lab here now. So what she wants to do is to have this reproducibility challenge around ICLR 2018, and what they want to do is to have people sort of start to reproduce the results from all of these papers. So how many of you are familiar with Archive? Okay, lots of people. That makes sense. So for those of you that don't know, Archive is this sort of open publishing platform where you can publish your preliminary drafts of any research that you've been doing in AI, and it's sort of a fast way to bypass, well, not bypass, but to speed up the process where you don't have to really look at peer review and be bogged down for months before you can actually put something out there. So it's a more a way to potentially get feedback on what you're publishing. So but coming back, when we're talking about reproducibility, what some people have demonstrated in the past is that just by switching libraries, of course, it makes a big difference. But even switching up OS versions led to a significant jump in the quality of results that they got, right? So they went in one of the papers, they went from Ubuntu 14 to Ubuntu 16, right? And they weren't able to exactly place what caused it, but they saw a big jump in the performance of and the quality of results from whatever research that they had presented, right? There are other things like the initial random configurations, especially in cloud environments where your VM instances are brought up sort of dynamically on demand. There's little guarantee that the underlying hardware is always going to be the same, even though they, profess to you having, a certain level of, speed on RAM and, CPU and network bandwidth and whatever, right? Because it's dynamically spawned, the instance, it creates fluctuations, right? So I guess the key, concern here is, well, how do you look at auditability in this scenario, right? Where you're not able to reproduce instances. So let's say we figure out this, mechanism where, you have, like PwCs of the world that start to, audit AI implementations for, let's say there was an adverse outcome, right? So now if you go back and you try to reproduce the results, and they're saying that, listen, like we use policy 1 and, we made sure that there would be no discrimination, and you go and try to reproduce the results and you can't, what does that do to auditability, right? So again, these are, some concerns that we need to think about. So yeah, I mean, I guess like I presented a very small sample of the issues that we're looking at in the Meetup group. There are many issues yet to be resolved. Like we're thinking about them. We don't have all the answers. We would hope that you will join us in helping us figure out the answers. And really, as I said, like from it's the entire phase, right? I had someone at the Montreal AI Symposium come and ask me after my presentation that, what is the role of researchers? Like, what is the responsibility of researchers? Well, I think there's a great responsibility there, because you're the ones who are, producing these, new research on and new developments in the field of AI. You're publishing papers that use certain data sets. But what you see often that is missing is there a qualification that the biases were addressed? Did they look at making sure that the samples were representative? What was the method of data collection? And all of those things are sort of glanced over because you're looking for the shiny new result in whatever new research area that you're looking at, right? So I think we need support from everybody that's involved. So I'll just give like a quick 30-second plug. You can reach me on LinkedIn. You can send me an email there. That's the Meetup group. So I made a URL shortener so you can remember it and go to it easily. And there's a Slack group as well, where what we do is we continue the discussions. We keep them ongoing between sessions as well, and it's proved to be quite productive so far. We've put together all of these different areas, and we've started to reason about them. And I think I'd be happy that folks from the crowd today, you guys can join and help us on this mission. That's it.
Do you have any questions for Abhishek before we? I have a question.
Yes.
Regarding the ethics, it's great that all the work has been done, but have you thought about the security aspect? Like, what's going to happen once, even if we have frameworks to, to cover everything, and it gets hacked? I mean, how can we prevent dangerous behaviors to happen? Is this something because I don't expect you to have an answer.
Yeah, no, okay, so given I think my cybersecurity background, I guess I can speak a little bit to it. A lot of it I think comes down to education, right? Like what I believe like we're doing with the Meetup group around AI ethics, like the stuff that I spoke to you about today, is more really to spark a conversation, right? It's more really for you guys to start thinking about this in whatever research or industry that you're working in. It's the same with cybersecurity, right? So when you're talking about your solutions getting hacked, like if you look at what happened with Equifax in Argentina, their password was username password was admin, right? Anyone who does penetration testing for a living, if they're what they're solved, the first thing that you would ever test out is, well, is it admin, right? Like, anybody can think of that. It's not even hard, right? So at that point, it's not even, do we have sufficient, cybersecurity practices? Because we do. to a great extent, we have best practices in the industry. It's just, and I see it personally as well in my work. Security always comes at the end because you always want to create the latest and greatest features. Because let's face it, security never sells. Nobody's buying your solution for the security. They're buying it for that new feature, a faster way to take a picture or get your food or get different kinds of food delivered to your house, right? So security always comes at the end, and I think it's again that fact about awareness. So we need to start like actively realizing that there are serious consequences, and I think even with large-scale data breaches, we've become a bit desensitized to it. So Yahoo admitted, I think it was a month ago or 2 months ago, that all 3 billion of their accounts were hacked, right? And okay, so we just move on, right? I guess we're so desensitized to shocking things happening with Trump. I hope I don't offend anyone in the audience, but with Trump, I mean, there's just so many shocking things that are said in the media, and you're like, okay, well, where do you put your focus on? And I think it's a great point. Cybersecurity needs to be a focus.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks. That's a great answer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think there was another question.
Yeah.
Okay.
No?
Perfect. Thank you very much, Abhishek.
All right.